When I was younger, I was part of the Scouts, something that at the time I considered one of the best experiences of my life. I loved the idea of camping outdoors, learning survival skills, and sharing stories around the campfire. The weekend camping trips were a sort of escape, a place where I could be myself and enjoy nature without worries. I had friends, a routine that I liked, and a group of guides who always seemed to know what to do in every situation. One of those camps, however, changed my life in a way I never could have imagined. It all started like any other adventurous weekend. They took us to a remote place, deep in a forest I had never visited before. I remember the excitement I felt as I got on the bus with my fellow Scouts, all of us eager for what awaited us. The place was beautiful, with a small lake that reflected the clear sky and trees so tall they seemed to touch the clouds. Our arrival was a whirlwind of activities, setting up the tents, gathering firewood, and preparing the area where we would carry out our daily activities. There was one guide in particular, the leader of our section, whom I had always admired for his knowledge and leadership. His name was Paulo, a man in his 30s with a constant smile and an innate ability to capture everyone's attention. During the first few days of the camp, everything seemed normal. Paulo was attentive, kind, and always ready to help us with anything we needed. But soon I noticed something strange in his behavior. It started with small gestures, like standing too close when he talked to me or keeping his hand on my shoulder for longer than necessary. At first I didn't think much of it. I thought maybe that was just his way, that there was nothing wrong with it. However, as each day passed, those interactions became more uncomfortable for me. I noticed that he watched me more than usual, and sometimes I would catch his gaze fixed on me from across the camp. One night after dinner, Paulo organized a small campfire just for our group. As we all sat around the fire, he began telling stories as he usually did. But that night I noticed that his attention was constantly directed at me. Every time he told an anecdote or made a joke, his eyes met mine, as if he were expecting a specific reaction from me. I felt uncomfortable, but I tried not to show it. After all, I didn't want to seem paranoid or draw attention from my friends. When the campfire ended, we all got ready to go to our tents. I offered to stay a bit longer and put out the fire since I had always liked the solitude of the night, under the stars. However, Paulo insisted on staying with me to make sure everything was in order. I accepted, though deep down I felt that something was wrong. As we extinguished the fire, Paulo began asking me personal questions about my life outside the Scouts, about my friends and family. At first, the questions seemed innocent, but gradually they became more intrusive. He asked if I had a boyfriend, if my parents were home, or traveled a lot for work. Each question made me more uncomfortable, but I tried to answer curtly, hoping he would pick up on my discomfort. But Paulo didn't stop. At one point, when we were almost ready to leave, he got too close. I could feel his breath near my face as he spoke to me in a soft, almost whispering tone. "You're very mature for your age, Paula," he said, and then he placed his hand on my arm, gripping it slightly. Panic overwhelmed me, but I didn't know how to react. My mind went blank, and all I wanted was to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. Somehow I managed to force a smile and excused myself, saying I was tired and needed to rest for the next day's activities. Paulo let me go, but not before running his hand through my hair, a gesture that made me shudder with disgust. I hurried to my tent, where my tent mates were already asleep, unaware of what had just happened. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I relived the moment when Paulo got too close to me, the tone of his voice, the pressure of his hand on my arm. I felt trapped, knowing I couldn't simply leave the camp and that I would have to face Paulo the next day. Thoughts of what might happen if I found myself alone with him again tormented me. I knew something was wrong, but at the time I didn't fully understand what it meant. I just felt fear and confusion. The following days at the camp were a mix of tension and apparent normalcy. Paulo continued with his guide duties, but he always found ways to be near me, to ask me questions that made me uncomfortable, or to touch me in ways that seemed innocent. But that made me feel dirty. I tried to avoid him as much as I could, always staying close to my friends, but he seemed to have a special talent for finding me when I was alone, even if just for a moment. On the last day of camp, as we were packing up to leave, Paulo asked me to accompany him to the storage area where we kept the equipment, under the pretense that he needed help gathering some things. My stomach churned, but I didn't know how to refuse without raising suspicion. I followed him with a growing sense of dread. The storage area was in a more isolated part of the camp, and when we arrived, I noticed there was no one else around. The place was dark and quiet, with only a couple of small windows letting in sunlight. Paulo closed the door behind us, and his attitude completely changed. He was no longer the kind, smiling guide everyone knew. His gaze was intense, almost predatory, and his voice took on a deeper tone as he told me he liked spending time with me, that I was special to him. I felt the air grow heavy, hard to breathe. I backed up against one of the walls, trying to put some distance between us, but he kept advancing. When he grabbed my arm, his grip was stronger than before, almost painful. I tried to pull away, but he was much stronger than me. He whispered things I don't want to remember, words that made me feel small, insignificant, and above all, terrified. At that moment, I knew I had to do something, that I had to get out of there no matter what. I mustered all my strength and told him that someone might come looking for us, that we needed to return to the others. It was a desperate attempt to buy time, to find a way out. Surprisingly, that seemed to unsettle him. His grip loosened for a moment, just enough for me to take a step back. I seized the opportunity and rushed toward the door. When I reached it, I flung it open and ran without looking back. I didn't care if anyone saw me. I just wanted to get away from him as fast as I could. I ran to the main area of the camp where everyone was already gathered, preparing to leave. I joined my tent mates, trying to steady my breathing and the trembling of my hands. The trip back home is a blur in my memory. I was too scared to tell anyone what had happened. I feared they wouldn't believe me, that they would think I had misinterpreted Paulo's intentions. But I knew in my heart that what had happened was wrong, that he had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. When I got home, my mother noticed something was wrong. She asked me how the camp had gone, and though I tried to pretend everything was fine, I couldn't hold back my tears. I told her everything, between sobs and broken words. Her reaction was immediate. She hugged me and assured me that everything would be okay, that I didn't have to worry anymore. My parents did the right thing and contacted the authorities and the scout organization. At first, there were doubts, awkward questions, and moments when I felt like maybe it had all been a misunderstanding. But in time, more girls began to speak up, telling similar stories about Paulo. It turned out this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and soon the truth came to light. Paulo was fired, and a case was opened against him for harassment and attempted abuse. I never found out the full outcome of his case, but I was assured that he would never work with children again. Despite that, the damage had already been done. The experience left a deep mark on me, a mix of fear and distrust that took years to overcome. Looking back, I realize how fortunate I was to have gotten out of that situation before things got even worse. But the impact of what I experienced at that camp stayed with me for a long time. For months, I had nightmares in which I relived those moments in the storage room, where I felt trapped and without escape. The simple act of being alone in a room with someone I didn't know well made me feel anxious, and I often avoided social situations where I might find myself alone with a man. My parents tried to support me in every way possible. They took me to therapy, and although it was hard for me to talk about what had happened at first, I gradually opened up. The therapist helped me understand that what happened wasn't my fault, that Paulo had abused his position of power, and that my fear and confusion were normal responses to an abnormal situation. She taught me to regain my confidence, to set clear boundaries, and to feel safe expressing them. As time passed, I started to reclaim my life. I got involved again in activities I had set aside out of fear, and though I decided not to return to the Scouts, I found other ways to enjoy nature and outdoor activities. I made new friends who helped me heal, and although the experience will always be part of my story, it no longer defines who I am. The news of the case opened against Paulo was a relief to me, but it also left me with questions. I wondered how someone like him had been in charge of young people for so long without anyone noticing what he was doing. I wondered how many other girls had gone through the same thing, how many hadn't had the chance to escape or be heard. Over the years, I've shared my story with others, especially young women who, like me back then, trust adults in positions of authority. I've told them to always listen to their instincts, that if something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't, and that they should never be afraid to speak up about what's happening to them, no matter what others might think. Today, when I think about that camp, I still feel a mix of emotions. There's a part of me that regrets the loss of that innocence, the way that experience changed my view of the world. But there's also a part of me that feels stronger, more aware, and determined not to let fear control my life. The fact that Paulo was fired and that there's an open case against him gives me some peace. But it also reminds me that justice sometimes comes too late and isn't always enough to repair the damage done. However, I've learned to find peace within myself, to forgive myself for not acting sooner, and to move forward with my life, knowing that despite everything, I'm a survivor of an experience that doesn't define me but has helped me grow and become stronger. I hope that my story can serve as both a warning and an inspiration to others. Because although it was a terrifying experience, it also showed me the importance of being brave, of speaking up when something isn't right, and of never allowing anyone to make you feel less than you are. Now, when I look to the future, I know I'll always be ready to face any situation with the strength and determination that this experience taught me. I had nothing to show from my experience, just my word and my memories, but as any lawyer will tell you, that's about as useful to the police as a chocolate teapot. There was nothing I could do. I had no recourse, nothing that wouldn't risk my own safety anyway. But then I realized there was something I could do, even if it was just an insignificant post on the internet, or an email that gets ignored, deleted, or lost, or whatever. Because if even one person reads this, who is thinking about hiking in Hammersley and actually listens and takes note, it could save a life. Because if I'm right and I wasn't being completely and absolutely paranoid, there's a couple out there setting traps for unsuspecting male hikers, and I only just barely avoided falling into one. After that incident, my wife and I decided to take a small hiking trip to southern Massachusetts, specifically to the Miles Standish State Forest. We checked out a few cabin rental options, found one that fit our budget, and booked it for a weekend. It was a beautiful spot not far from a heart-shaped pond, with easy access to all the different hiking trails around the park. Our first day was wonderful. We had a picnic near College Pond, followed by a basic campfire-style dinner at our cabin. The day was beautiful, but the night was intimidating, to say the least. There were many small campsites and cabins scattered throughout the forest, so it wasn't like we were in a particularly isolated place. But the night in the city is very different from the night in the woods, especially if you grew up and spent most of your life in the former. There's something very unsettling about it, so much so that both my wife and I commented on it separately from each other. We weren't scared at all. We felt very safe there, so it was just a new feeling, I guess, and not something that kept us up at night. The second day was similar to the first. We did some hiking, had another outdoor lunch, and then returned to the cabin in time for dinner. But instead of eating at the cabin, we went to Mirbeau, just south of Plymouth, for a fancy 3-course dinner and a bottle of wine. We discussed the possibility of taking a taxi back and forth to the Mirbeau resort. But I decided I wanted to be fresh for the next morning, so I drove and my wife drank. The wine hit her really well, so much so that by the time we got back to the cabin, she was so drunk that she fell asleep the moment her head hit the pillow. I didn't begrudge her the chance to enjoy a drink like that. I found it amusing, but it turned out to be very fortunate that only one of us drank that night, and I'll tell you why. After my wife fell asleep and was snoring very loudly, I should add, I brushed my teeth, showered, and then got into bed. It was just before midnight at that point, and I set an alarm for 7:30 in the morning. I don't know how long after that I woke up to what I assumed was my phone vibrating on the rustic wooden nightstand next to my head. I reached for it, only to realize it wasn't my phone making the noise. It was something completely different. Something was softly scratching the wood on the other side of the cabin wall, almost right next to where my head had been resting. Now, while this was creepy for a second or two, I'm rational enough to realize that a sound like that was probably some kind of animal, and having done my research, I knew that the only things we had to worry about were snakes and possibly foxes or coyotes. There generally aren't bears or mountain lions in this area of Massachusetts, or rather the chances of encountering the former at least are extremely remote. That was the reason we chose that state forest in the first place, knowing it was one of the safest hiking options. So, as I said, hearing the sound was surprising but not terrifying at first. I tried to go back to sleep, hoping that whatever was making the scratching noise would just get bored and leave. I know many animals scratch their claws or teeth against wood as a way of filing or sharpening them, so I thought maybe it was something small and harmless doing exactly that. But then the scratching started to move, and it seemed like it was coming from another section of the wall much higher than before. I say much higher, but it was only maybe a foot or two higher. Still in my mind, what was making the noise went from being the size of a squirrel to the size of a fox. Again, this was quite alarming, and I lifted my head from the pillow, wondering if I should do something. In the end, I got out of bed, went over to where I could hear the scratching, and then knocked on the wall a few times to try to scare it off. Sure enough, that seemed to work, and the sound of my fist hitting the wall didn't wake my wife, so I climbed back into bed without saying a word. I swear I was just about to fall asleep again when the scratching noise started up once more. I realized that if I wanted anything close to a good night's sleep, I'd have to go outside with my flashlight and really scare this thing off. So, I got out of bed, put on some clothes, and then stepped out into the darkness with my flashlight. I could still hear whatever it was scratching against the wood, but I wasn't scared in the slightest since I figured it would just run off the moment it saw the beam of my flashlight or heard my footsteps. It did exactly that, and I heard it running off into the darkness just before I turned the corner. But instead of the familiar four-legged rhythm of a fox or coyote, I heard the very distinct sound of something running on 2 feet, not 4. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, and I swear to God that realization was the most terrifying moment of my entire life. All this time I thought everything was fine, but there had been some damn creep scratching something into the wood the whole time, and I had actually tried to go back to sleep. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed the biggest, heaviest thing I could find, a frying pan, and then rushed outside again. I wanted to yell something brave and strong, but the truth of God is that I was scared out of my mind. I could barely hold a clear thought in my head, let alone think of something intimidating to shout. So I just ran around, spinning like a top, shining the flashlight on every little shadow to make sure no one was about to sneak up on me. Once I was pretty sure the coast was actually clear, I ran back to the cabin, locked the front door, and then woke up my wife. She was still half drunk, but she sobered up quickly when I told her to keep her phone handy in case she needed to call 911. I still don't know if it was just a dumb prank or something that kids were doing, vandalizing the cabins or deliberately trying to scare us or something like that. It all depended on what they had been scratching into the wall. That much was clear. But I wasn't in the mood to just wander back out into the dark to go check right away. We stayed put for a few minutes with my hand firmly around the frying pan's handle, listening for any voices, footsteps, or scratching. After a few minutes of silence, I finally sneaked out into the dark for 2 reasons. Number 1, to make sure we really were alone again, and number 2, to find out what the hell this creep had been doing on the exterior wall of the cabin. I was scared, but I was also ready to bash someone's head in if anyone was stupid enough to attack me. Thankfully, I didn't have to defend myself like that. But what I found scratched into the cabin was far from reassuring. At first glance, it looked like a 0 or the letter O beneath a roughly scratched U or V. The result was that it almost looked like someone had tried to write VL, but vertically instead of horizontally. No word came to mind immediately. I mean, if it had been an O and then an I, maybe they were trying to write the word kill, in which case we should be worried. The VO, I had no idea what that could mean. Convinced it was nothing more than kids being stupid little vandals, I told my wife it was safe to come outside and that she could see what the kids had been scratching. She seemed relieved to know it wasn't anything too sinister, and that they probably wouldn't bother us for the rest of our stay. In fact, all that occupied our thoughts for a minute or two was wondering if the owners would keep our security deposit if they discovered the damage. After my wife put on some clothes, we both went out to check the damage. I shone my flashlight, showing her the strange V and O shapes, and I watched as a very visible expression of fear crossed her face. I asked what she thought it was, and she asked how I couldn't see it. To me, they were just strange shapes or letters, but to her it was literally the devil. I'll be honest, I didn't really see it at first and thought it was just her nerves talking, but her fear turned out to be contagious. When she decided she didn't want to stay another night in the cabin, I wasn't in a position to argue. I remember her saying, "This has all the warning signs. We'd be idiots if we didn't leave now." And honestly, she was right. It didn't really matter who it was or why they were scratching something into the wall of our cabin. Our car was out front and they could literally see the cabin was occupied. And who the hell goes prowling through the woods in the middle of the night like that? No one with good intentions, that's for sure. We packed up our things, loaded them all into the car, and then left as soon as we could. First, my wife called the police to report what had happened, and then she left a message with the cabin owner explaining the situation. They were kind enough to refund us the last night of our stay, and returned our security deposit in full, which ruled out our weird conspiracy theory that the owners were trying to keep our deposit. We still have no idea who or what was really going on that night, and honestly, I'm open to the idea that we just overreacted to a dumb prank or something. But that said, I have no regrets about cutting our little vacation short because my wife was right. We've seen enough horror movies to know that you don't stay when things get weird. I've been hiking and camping for as long as I can remember. I was an Eagle Scout, and after that, I managed to convince a few friends from high school and later college to join me on some trips. My passion for the outdoors remained strong long after I graduated, but as all my old hiking buddies started drifting away from the hobby, it became increasingly difficult to organize a trip. In the end, it seemed that if I wanted to hike as regularly as I wanted, I would have to start going solo. At first, solo hiking seemed a little boring. I mean, what's the point of all these experiences if you can't share them with someone? Adversity and struggle forged strong bonds between people, and that was half the joy of it. Each trip brought another set of adventures and memories. I'm talking about real experiences, not just getting drunk and sharing funny videos among ourselves. But it turns out that solo hiking is actually pretty fun. Suddenly, I wasn't limited by what anyone else wanted to do, where they wanted to go, or when a trip could take place. I could just think about it and go. Leave work on a Friday afternoon and then spend the whole weekend in the woods before being back in bed by Sunday night? Why not? Take an entire week to trek a section of the Appalachian Trail? Why not? The only real issue with going solo is safety. I began to envy my European friends, especially those from the UK. They can head out alone with nothing more than a fully charged phone, some tea, and a few scones, you know? Whereas here in the US, you need bear spray, a GPS system, and sometimes a gun if you want to feel truly safe. I'm not saying I was terrified every time I went somewhere, but you hear enough stories to know that it's better to be prepared than to be caught off guard. I only carried a gun with me once. It was in the Sierra and was for bears and big cats. But like anywhere else you might go, it's not the wildlife you need to be afraid of. It's the people. As I mentioned, you hear some really crazy stories, and I heard a lot of them right up until I stumbled into my own cautionary tale, one that began when I met a girl. So one weekend, I decided to take a trip to the Hammersley Wild area, which is like a designated wildlife zone nestled between Elk and Susquehanna state parks. As its name suggests, it's one of the wildest and most remote areas of natural beauty in the state of Pennsylvania. You have to drive to a little place called Cross Forks, and then turn down a back road until the asphalt ends and the trail begins. There are 1 or 2 small houses out there, but they don't mind you parking there as long as you don't leave a mess, and the place is so remote that there's barely anyone else around to worry about your car getting messed with. But when I arrived late Friday afternoon, there was another car there with a girl leaning against it. She was cute, dressed in hiking gear, but she looked upset. Not exactly furious or anything, but very bothered by something. I parked a little distance from her, not wanting to disturb her or draw any anger, and then I got out and started unpacking my gear from the trunk. I didn't want to be a creep or start an unwanted conversation or anything, so I just resigned myself to walking past her and minding my own business. But as I started walking, we made a bit of awkward eye contact and we got to talking. We greeted each other, and I asked if she was okay, and she said no, and well, that was that. It turned out a friend had bailed on her for a hike she'd been really looking forward to, and she didn't feel like driving back home with nothing to show for the trip. She was debating going on the trail alone, but also wanted to see if she could convince her friend to come out after all, as she was very aware that hiking solo as a woman wasn't the smartest idea. I told myself that it was the right thing to do, but I also knew that inviting her to hike with me was a great way to get to know a very pretty girl who clearly shared a passion for the outdoors. So I did just that and asked if she wanted to join me. There was a definite moment of hesitation in her. She didn't seem like the kind of girl who'd just go walking down a remote forest trail with a complete stranger, and for a second, I thought she was going to politely decline. But then there was this kind of flash of spontaneity in her eyes before she looked at me with a big smile and said, "Sure." She told me her name was Alma, and as we walked I explained that I was planning to camp somewhere and stay the whole weekend, but I'd be happy to walk her back to her car whenever she was ready to leave. She thanked me, said it was sweet of me to offer, and then we kept breaking the ice and chatting a bit. Then, once we felt more comfortable with each other, I can safely say it was one of the best first dates I'd ever been on. It definitely had that vibe. I'm no Disney prince or anything, but I'm not bad looking. and I know when a girl is flirting with me and not just being polite or friendly or whatever. So as we walked and talked, I started getting pretty excited about where this might go. It had been a while since I'd tried dating someone, and my brief foray into Tinder had been a total disaster. Meeting someone naturally had always seemed a lot more appealing to me than using the internet to force something. But, as I'm sure many of you will agree, that's much easier said than done. Since it was a mutual interest, we talked a lot about hiking at first. Places we'd been, close calls we'd had, and things like that. But as time went on, we started talking about other things too, like our jobs, our families, and relationships. She told me she'd been single for a while but wasn't looking for anything at the moment. However, she was quick to add that if the right thing came along, she'd be open to changing her mind about not looking. It seemed like a loaded statement, but it was very welcome. And as we kept walking, I wondered if this chance encounter with her was the beginning of some lifelong romance. Now looking back, I'm really embarrassed by how naive that sounds, but I guess loneliness is a crazy thing. Maybe an hour into our hike, we were walking along the edge of a stream when Alma stopped to take a picture. Then she asked me to give her a second while she sent a message to her friend, saying she didn't have enough signal for a call but could probably force through a text. To me, it was a very familiar dance. Hammersley is pretty close to a town, but thanks to all the hills surrounding us, cell service is hard to come by. While she was texting, I wandered a little farther downstream, just waiting for Alma to finish doing her thing when something caught my eye. Maybe 50 or 60 yards downstream, a flash of movement in the trees, just very slightly, but I definitely saw something. I walked back to Alma to ask if she had any bear spray or something like that, and when she said yes, I didn't feel completely at ease. It was nice to know that we could both defend ourselves in case of an animal attack, but at the same time I didn't want anything to ruin our hike, especially if that something came in the form of a bear. I told her I thought I'd seen something downstream. She said she'd stay alert, and then we went on our way as usual. Maybe an hour or so later, we emerged from the trees and reached an open meadow that sloped gently upward. When we got to the top, or rather where the gentle slope turned into a steep hill, we stopped and turned around to take in the view. Nothing had followed us into the meadow, so I figured we were fine in terms of wildlife. But just to be sure, I decided to pull out a little monocular or a spyglass for you pirate fans that I carried with me to check the tree line below us. I scanned it and didn't see anything. But then I scanned it a second time and saw a dark figure moving parallel to the tree line. I couldn't make out any details due to the difference in light, but there was definitely something there. And just when I thought it might be an innocent hiker, I was turning into the object of my own paranoia. The figure stopped, turned sideways, and just stood still. At first I thought maybe they were peeing or something, but then I realized they were watching us. I immediately directed Alma's attention to the figure, pointing out where I had been looking before handing her the monocular. She held it to her eye, listened again as I gave her directions on where to look, and then gave me a skeptical response when I asked if she could see anything. She asked if I was absolutely sure the person had been watching us, and to be fair, I didn't know for sure. I just had a bad feeling based on the small flash of movement in the trees near the stream. I tried again to get her to look in the right spot, then politely took back the monocular to check for myself. And when I did, there was no one there, or at least not where I had been looking originally. I scanned the tree line a third time in almost as many minutes, and this time there was nothing there, but I still felt very uneasy and suggested that we keep moving. Our original plan was to walk around the base of the hill we'd reached and then head back along the same trail toward where Alma's car was parked. But because of how uneasy I was feeling, I suggested we hike around instead so we wouldn't have to retrace our steps. I could see Alma starting to get suspicious of my intentions. There she was, having agreed to a short hike with a stranger, probably out of sheer courtesy. And here I was trying to convince her to go even deeper into the woods with talk of possible shady stalkers. She seemed skeptical, but agreed, probably knowing she could use the bear spray on me if I started getting too handsy, which wasn't my intention at all. After walking another mile or so, the tension started to lift. No one was following us. At least it didn't seem that way. And I began to think I was just being too paranoid. Like my nerves from trying to win her over were manifesting as something else, you know? And speaking of that, that was the only thing I was focused on from that point on. Alma kept reassuring me, making lighthearted comments about how I was desperate for an excuse to save her, so I relaxed more and more, forgetting what I assumed had just been a coincidence. Not long after we re-entered the woods, we came to what I like to call the Babbling Brook. I first heard that term in a Bob Ross video I watched on YouTube, and this place is one of those larger streams, looking like something he would have painted himself. Sometimes people criticize Pennsylvania for how industrialized some parts of it are, but there's a lot of natural beauty here, and sharing it with my potential date, I was hoping to boost my chances a bit. Alma loved the place and started taking pictures while I walked around with a satisfied grin on my face. She liked the spot so much that she wanted to stay a while, rest, and have some snacks. And while she did that, she planned to text her friend with the pictures, if the signal allowed, to show him what he was missing out on. While Alma was busy trying to send messages, I excused myself to go relieve myself somewhere private, and then I headed into the trees to find a secluded spot. I found a place and did my business. Then, just as I turned to head back, I heard something in the trees behind me. Immediately, I remembered that feeling of being followed, only this time, I made an effort to find out if there really was something or someone trailing us. I started walking directly toward where I'd heard the noise, calling out and asking if anyone was there. And that's when I saw him. This big guy, dressed in hiking gear, was walking away from me at a pace I found odd. The hiking gear was somewhat reassuring in a way, like I could give him the benefit of the doubt. But at the same time, I was now faced with the evidence that we were being followed. Hammersley is a big place, and sure, it gets somewhat busy on weekends, but not on a Friday afternoon, which is half the reason I like arriving at that time in the first place. The odds of just running into someone, especially off the trails, are slim. So as much as I was convinced we were being followed, I still wanted to confront the guy to at least make sure. I called out to him, not aggressively, just to get his attention, you know. I planned to ask something pretty innocent like, "Are you okay?" or something like that, just to gauge his mood. But when he turned around, I was stunned. He was dressed like a hiker, yes, but he had on these thick, heavy gloves, almost like those riot gloves you see with the hard knuckles, and the lower half of his face was covered with a hunting scarf, the kind that only leaves the person's eyes exposed. While a face covering like that was totally normal in 2020 and 2021, and even now it's still somewhat acceptable, seeing something like that in 2015 wasn't common, especially since the guy had no orange indicators on his clothes for hunting, or more importantly, no visible weapon that I could see. I was somewhat relieved to see that he wasn't holding any kind of weapon, but the fact that he was covering his face meant he was obviously up to something bad. And then there was the fact that he just refused to answer me when I finally asked if everything was all right. He just stared at me for a second, then turned back around and walked off into the woods. At that moment, my mind was racing. Following us along a single trail was one thing, but this guy had potentially tracked our path through an open meadow, and then just kept following our trail, even after we crossed the hill and took what seemed like a random route. I like to think of myself as an outdoorsy guy, but to me, those were some incredibly precise tracking skills. And if this guy was using his powers for evil, then that was going to be a big problem for us. I quickly returned to where Alma was, told her exactly what I had seen, and said we needed to move fast. I told her I knew I sounded crazy, and that I completely understood why she'd think I was a lunatic or whatever, but I'd rather her think I was a lunatic and survive than not act and risk our lives. So many awful things seem to happen because people don't stop and just say to themselves, "This isn't normal or safe, and I need to leave." And I was having one of those moments right then and there. I gave my little speech at machine gun speed, you know, and honestly, I thought I'd convinced her for a second. But when I finished and started walking away while calling for her to follow me, she just stood there. I remember saying, "We need to go, Alma, now." But instead of following me, she scolded me. She said I was acting like a complete idiot, and that if we were being followed, she would have already noticed something. She wasn't some helpless girl either, so she resented me acting like she was, and according to her, just because someone was on our trail didn't mean they were acting maliciously. They were all good points, and on any other occasion I might have accepted them, but I knew this wasn't just any other occasion. Something was clearly wrong with this shady guy, and we needed to exercise due caution immediately. And that's when I started noticing this kind of gradual shift in the way Alma was talking to me. It went from something like, "Come on, man, you're being ridiculous," and urging me to stay, to accusing me of being a mix of dumb, cowardly, and mentally unstable. I wanted to escort her back to her car. She wanted to stay where we were and not even move further down the brook. And if I wanted to move or leave her, then I wasn't half the man I thought I was, among other personal attacks from her. I just remember feeling confused beyond belief. Honestly, it felt like some weird dream. It seemed like any girl in her right mind would at least be a little alarmed at the prospect of being followed by a masked man. But here was Alma, not even slightly concerned while seeing how visibly shaken I was as I warned her about the potential danger. The only mitigating factor, I guess, was the idea that she thought I was the one trying to trick her into going somewhere more remote to, I don't know, pull some Ted Bundy-style stuff without being caught. That I totally got, and I suspected her reluctance came from that place, not from being dumb or naive or dismissive by not responding to my warnings. We were both being pretty loud by then, arguing back and forth, and I realized that our volume would make it really easy for someone to locate us and catch us off guard. I remember looking around just to make sure we were still alone, and I got that skin-crawling feeling that comes with knowing you're really being watched. I honestly thought that if I just started walking away, Alma would somehow snap out of it and follow me, so that's what I did. I started walking, looking back only once to see if she was following or not. She looked furious. I mean, really angry, and obviously because she wasn't going to get what she wanted. But there was something else to it too. She wasn't going to get what she wanted, but what she was planning wasn't something spontaneous that she could just go ahead and do without me. It was something she had put a lot of time, effort, and emotion into, something that was so close to being pulled off but was falling apart at the last minute. I guess with the gift of hindsight, some of you might have already figured out what was going on, but at that moment what was really happening was almost entirely inconceivable to me. Almost, but not quite. I realized that two of the big questions I had in front of me had answers that were intrinsically linked. The reason the guy with the hunting gear was able to find us so easily was intertwined with the reason Alma wanted to stay at that exact spot near the babbling brook. The masked stranger and my new hiking partner were working together. Now, I know I couldn't have known that for sure at the time, and I'm not even sure how to describe how rapid and frantic my thought process was in that moment, but once again, it was a case of getting out of there. Being wrong but living, or not trusting my instincts and potentially facing something I wouldn't walk away from. And being the kind of person I am, I chose the path of least resistance. I started walking, still not believing how surreal it all was. It was a real this can't be happening right now moment, like I couldn't believe how things had started so well, but had gone so horribly wrong in just 1 or 2 hours. But at least I could still see the funny side, or the kind of funny side. Maybe I was being a complete idiot, and then I'd look back on that hike as the time I ruined my chance because of a weird bout of paranoia. Unfortunately, that funny side was only visible for a few seconds because after that, any benefit of the doubt was washed away by an ear-piercing scream that followed me through the trees. You have to understand, too, hearing these 3 little words probably made up the most terrifying moment of my entire life. All I heard after a few seconds of silence was Alma screaming, "He's getting away." The second I heard that, I just ran. I don't know if it was realizing that all that paranoia was justified, but I'm serious when I say that when everything came together like that, I felt my heart pounding out of my chest. I had no idea where the guy was, if he was close, or what he had in his pack, so I unclipped my backpack, dropped it off my back, and then moved my legs faster than I ever had before, and I didn't stop until I felt like I was going to throw up. I always wore this kind of fishing jacket, the kind with lots of pockets, and I kept all my absolutely essential items in there, including my car keys. If they'd been in my pack, I would have had to run with it, and in that case, I honestly don't know if I'd be here to write this. After stopping for maybe a minute to catch my breath, I kept moving through the trees back toward my truck, trying not to trip and fall on my face while constantly looking over my shoulder. I knew the guy wasn't some master tracker anymore. He had obviously been coordinating with that supposed Alma, if that was even her real name, but I still had that fear that I'd look over my shoulder and he'd just be there. Thankfully, that wasn't the case, and I reached my truck, jumped in, and drove off. I kept telling myself I'd call the police as soon as I got home. But when the time came to do it, I realized it might not be a good idea. I don't think any kind of crime had been committed, in which case what exactly was I going to report? I didn't even try to recover my backpack or anything, and if it wasn't there, the minimum I could report was a theft or something. So that's what I decided to do. I waited a day to try and make sure no one was using it as bait or whatever, and then I went back to recover it and I found it intact. In fact, I found myself hoping that someone had, I don't know, maybe gone through it or tried to damage it somehow, like there might be DNA or maybe fingerprints, I guess. But no, my backpack was there exactly where I dropped it, completely untouched. have an experience to share with you that happened to me and a group of my very close friends. But before I go into detail, let me give you some context. My name is Tom. I weigh about 164 pounds and am 5 feet 10 inches tall. I'm 25 years old and love the outdoors so much that I actually founded a club in high school called the Outdoor Grizzlies. It was a small group of us that organized different hiking trips. We hiked the beautiful trails of Sleeping Giant State Park in Connecticut and went to Julia Pfeiffer Burns State Park in California, which has a fantastic 80-foot waterfall with a lush landscape. In this group were my friends and my best friend from high school, Jake, my good friend who I met in freshman year, Jennifer, and Jake's girlfriend since high school, Christine. The four of us were inseparable and we did all our hikes together. In high school, we would do fundraising, and the school saw how much we loved nature and that we could make a career out of it, so they gladly let us go ahead. We were all in decent shape, which is why we loved doing what we did. Not only did it clear our minds and give us clarity, but it also eased some of the anxiety often experienced as teenagers, as well as depression. At least, we didn't have to go through it very often. Like I said, hiking really helped cope with it. Even our teachers came along with us at some point and said it really helped them manage their stress and anxiety too. But after we graduated high school, the club fizzled out. We all kept in touch and everything, like most people do after high school, but life happens. The only person I really kept in touch with was Jake. He and Christine were still together, but he rarely talked about hiking because it just wasn't in our blood anymore. Jennifer was doing her own thing and was dating a college athlete named Robert. And except for Jake, we all drifted apart for a few years. One night in May, I decided it would be nice to have a campfire, just a few close friends. Christine didn't really want to hang out with people she didn't know, and she had the brilliant idea of inviting Jennifer. Through the power of social media, it turned out that Jennifer was very happy and willing to come. She talked about how life got in the way between her and Robert and how they broke up. The campfire would be just what she needed to catch up and talk about life, and it would be like old times. She said her number was still the same and to call her to confirm. It was easier than I thought. Suddenly I was filled with happiness and excitement. It was going to be like old times. When the campfire happened, everything went off without a hitch. We had a fantastic time. It was around 1:30 in the morning and everyone else had left. The ones remaining were me, Jake, Jennifer, and Christine. The cool spring breeze kissed my neck and the fire tickled my nose, leaving me with chills. Jake mentioned how peaceful and nostalgic it felt as he finished his beer. The energy in the group was so nice, and Jennifer mentioned how I once slipped on a wet rock trying to run from an unusual bug, which we all dubbed the bug incident. We all laughed, and Jake said if only we could relive those days. Christine looked at Jennifer and said, "Maybe we can't go back, but can we live them?" Then a sudden idea crossed all of our minds. You see, we had always talked about going somewhere exotic and having a big hike there. That was our dream years ago. But then the spark of genius filled all of us, and we formed a plan to go to Hawaii. Luckily for us, Jake's aunt was a flight attendant. I had some money saved for a rainy day. Jennifer had saved money for a trip she was going to take on her own, and Christine had a decent following on YouTube from her makeup channel and was confident that whatever she lacked, she'd get through crowdfunding. After 3 weeks, we pooled our finances and could afford the trip. We were going to stay in the Honolulu area because there was a well-known hiking spot with a beautiful waterfall. We arrived at our destination and decided to be tourists for the first 3 days, leaving the last 3 to hike around the area, with the 7th day to prepare to leave. However, we wanted to take it a step further and wanted to camp there too. We had done it many times before and were well versed in camping, so we felt we could handle it without an issue. We ventured deeper and deeper into the forest. We saw people along the trail, tourists, talked to some friendly locals, and then started noticing how much more isolated it was becoming. Christine mentioned that we seemed to be far out and didn't have cell signal anymore. She bought a compass and a map, so she said we should find a spot in the area we were in, and we all agreed. We found a beautiful spot, almost as if it was waiting for us. It was on a cliff overlooking almost the entire island. At that moment, we realized how far we had hiked, and it was relatively safe. There was a bamboo fence, so you couldn't really fall off unless you intentionally threw yourself over the fence. But even then, there was a large enough rock jutting out to keep you from falling. It was the most magnificent view I had ever seen. We set up the tent we had and some lanterns around the fire to keep the bugs away. Jennifer and Christine wanted to explore nearby to see if there was anything interesting while Jake and I were setting everything up. That's when we heard the girls shout, "Hey, we found a clearing through the bushes. Oh, and there are stairs." I thought they were joking. When we went to look, we saw they were quite worn down and led to a rock slab at the bottom. To give you a better perspective, if you imagine Pride Rock from The Lion King, we were standing on the flat part, then imagine another flat piece at the bottom but with stairs around it connecting the two. Jennifer was against going down the worn stairs because she was scared someone might get hurt, but we had to know what was down there, and Jake and I said we would go while the girls stayed behind by their own choice. The stairs were stone, somewhat worn down, but as we got halfway, they weren't so bad. We finally got down and saw that it was a slab of rock we had been standing on up top. It was like a cave underneath. We ventured in and we could hear our footsteps crunching broken coconut shells and sand as we walked. Jake turned on his flashlight and shone it inside. We were in awe. There seemed to be carvings on the walls and what looked like a burial site. They seemed disturbed, but the carvings intrigued us. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it at the wall. We could make out bodies with very small heads. The walls seemed intact. We carefully swept the debris off the wall. We needed more light to make sense of the carvings and called the girls down, who reluctantly came. We asked them to turn on their flashlights and point them at the wall. We all did the same and they were astonished. We took pictures and agreed to report this place to the information desk when we left. Maybe we had discovered something forgotten by time. Then Christine said the carvings told a sequence of events from right to left as we looked. It simply looked like a figure being pushed off a ledge. At that moment, we all got chills and decided to head back up. Jake broke the silence and said to remember that the carvings were probably thousands of years old. It was just history. But we agreed it was still creepy, and that if it rained, we'd seek shelter in the cave, but that would be a last resort. We opted to explore not too far from the camp, but just to scout around. We were all inspired since we stumbled upon the carvings on the wall. Maybe we'd be lucky enough to find something else. We were about 15 minutes into the hike when we realized the sun was beginning to set, and Christine said we should probably head back. We didn't want to get caught in the dark since it would obviously make things harder for us trying to return to camp. As we made our way back, we heard crunching and branches snapping. Christine grabbed Jake and Jennifer clung to my arm. We thought it was an animal and braced ourselves just in case. Suddenly, the large leaves parted and what looked like a native Hawaiian man in a straw hat and a touristy-looking shirt emerged from the bushes. He asked why we were there. We explained that we were hikers, that we had a camp not far from the rock, and told him about the strange carvings we saw on the wall. His eyes widened and it felt like they pierced our souls. He said he'd give us a bit of advice, and that advice was to pack up and leave, that bad things happened there and that a curse had been placed on the area and we should go. We all asked why. The man looked at us before saying, "The night marchers." He then said night was approaching, and we should find somewhere safe and never look them in the eyes. With that final cryptic message, he left. We all looked at each other. Jake said, "Did we really come all the way out here just to leave?" We decided it would only be one night and dawn would soon come. We'd just pack up and leave in the morning. We didn't want to mess with anything, so we went back to camp. When we finally returned, Jennifer remembered that she had brought a pot and 2 cans of clam chowder with pita bread. We lit the fire and enjoyed a reasonable dinner. It was one of the best nights we had had since our high school days. Christine looked at her watch and noted it was 12:45 in the morning. I'll never forget the time because that was the night from hell. We decided to get ready for bed. 2 people could fit in a tent, and since it was so beautiful outside, Jennifer and I opted to admire the stars and lay down to sleep under them. I remember thinking to myself that I had only seen skies like that on my computer wallpaper. It was so magical that I drifted off to sleep. I remember waking up to use the bathroom. There wasn't really a bathroom, so I decided to head into the forest. It was silent. No animals making noise, no insects, nothing. It was eerie, like time had stopped. I walked silently behind the tent toward some bushes to relieve myself when I suddenly heard a horn. I'm not sure what it was, but it sounded like a horn. I just dismissed it as a hallucination and went back to sleep. Suddenly, as I was drifting off, I heard what sounded like a drum. My fingers tapped the ground to the beat of the drum as it got louder. Jake woke up, peeked out of the tent, and looked at me. "How do you have signal? Turn it down." I told Jake it wasn't me. Now, if you knew Jake, he could be very serious and only called me by my full name in these situations. "Thomas, stop messing around and go to sleep. You know we have to get up early," he said, rubbing his eyes and looking at his Apple Watch. Suddenly, the horn blared again, this time louder. Jennifer sat up suddenly. The drum was even closer. Christine was still fast asleep. At that moment, we realized the sounds were coming from everywhere, and we felt cornered. As they got closer, we were frozen and hatched a plan to leave. Jake went back to the tent, and I could hear him whispering to Christine. I was trying to gather our things and motioned for Jennifer to grab her backpack, but she was just staring behind me. I got a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. I turned around to look while I could hear Jake packing his stuff in the tent. My fight-or-flight instinct kicked in. As I slowly turned my head, that's when I saw a man at least 6 feet tall holding a machete. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. It was his head. It was very small, and what seemed to be a coconut was on his head. Or at least that was covering his head, and it was no bigger than a coconut. We were all frozen in fear. I immediately pushed Jennifer to stop looking at the monster, and she reacted, grabbed me, and we ran, with Jake and Christine following us. We had no idea which direction we were going. We just ran. We left all our belongings and heard footsteps and branches breaking, as if at least 10 or more of them were chasing us. I don't know how we made it through the forest. Christine noticed a fast river and thought we could lose them if we crossed it. We jumped in and started wading across, but it kept getting deeper, and before we knew it, the river had swept us away. We looked back and saw 5 of them on the riverbank, holding various weapons. They weren't following us anymore, just watching. That moment will be etched in my mind as long as I live. The image of them on the riverbank as we slowly drifted away. I don't think I'll ever forget those medium-height beings with small heads, and I ended up passing out. I woke up with the sun in my face and Christine shaking me. I had a gash on my head, and Jake and the rest of us were covered in scratches and bruises. Before we could talk, we heard a helicopter overhead. We were flown back to the island for medical attention. I asked how they found us. Apparently, a ping from the Apple Watch sent the coordinates at 4:55, and they had been searching for us for 4 hours. Christine was just crying, and Jennifer was hugging her. Jake and I looked at each other. The guy added that we should never have been there in the first place. Local authorities came to talk to us and asked what had happened. We told them about the carvings and the men with small heads. They explained it was just folklore, but people get so scared of the night marchers that they end their own lives because their minds can't handle what they see. They had only 2 documented cases of suicides, one of a 19-year-old girl who jumped off the cliff where we had been camping, and another person. They suspended the search because the authorities refused to look when night approached. The area was closed to the public after 4 decapitated bodies were found in the 1980s, and they never found the perpetrators. He went on to say we must have been way off the trail to reach that rocky area because it's completely closed off. They seemed confused about how we got there in the first place. I felt chills run down my spine. What the hell did we see? Was that even a head? How could they breathe or see anything with the coconut covering them? I asked if the night marchers had heads. He said that since we were alive to tell the tale, they hadn't removed the coconut shell, but if we had died and jumped off the cliff like the young woman, we apparently would have known the answer. After this, we decided to take a long break from hiking or camping and only met up at a bar. The 4 of us really didn't talk much about it. I'm sure that's not surprising to anyone. It almost ended our friendship, but now after 4 years, I'm glad we've been able to somewhat move on.